Coaching in Session.
Your exclusive destination for unparalleled personal and professional growth.
With your host, Michael Rearden.
Whether you choose to live within limits or break free, your mindset journey begins here.
Welcome, Sean Kullman, to Coaching in Session. How are you doing today?
Great, Michael. Thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks so much for coming on. Today, we're going to be talking about your work, educator, coach, and we're going to be diving into your book in just a moment. I love the title of it. I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to let you do it. But it's a powerful title, and it is something our world is experiencing firsthand. And it's not just about one gender, though. It's both genders in a sense. The onslaught of education in children and what's being taught to them and how they're living life is very different today than when you grew up, or maybe even when I was growing up. And I was at an event yesterday, and the event was talking about how we grew up so differently and how our children are growing up at a different time. So there's so much to be said about the mind and children and development and education and learning. We're going to be diving into that in just a moment, but could you tell the world who you are, what you do, and of course, how you help?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me again, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. And I like the fact that you're talking about a little bit of two different worlds today, because we are seeing some challenges for our young men and our young women. But my work really is, I'm the president of the Global Initiative for Boys and Men, and we'll get into my book later. And I wrote a book, and we essentially, I wrote it with Michael Rearden, who is the head of the Reven Institute, New York Times bestselling author. And really what our work does is it focuses on sex differences, and particularly brain sex differences, and how we need to look at how we educate our boys and how we educate our girls and how we coach our boys and how we coach our girls. And when you talk to coaches who coach boys who are like 9 and girls, their experiences are so incredibly different. And so much of that just has to do with what's going on inside that little head of theirs. Right. And so that is where my work area is. I educate policymakers. I write regularly on Substack in his words. And the book really does focus on several core areas, such as education, physical and mental health, fatherhood, family, relationship issues, employment and the workforce, and things like that. But I really do research and advocacy on things that improve the lives of boys and men. I was a teacher for a long time. I taught English, which is always the boys' favorite subject, at nearly every level, middle school, high school, and college.
You said English was the boys'
favorite subject, yeah.
Definitely not for me. It was definitely my least favorite subject. It's probably because I wasn't strong in it. It was math for me. I enjoyed math more than English, but it did switch in college, though, where I enjoyed English and writing so much more, is because I found teachers that really were passionate about teaching me and looking at my blind spots and looking at the areas where I was weak versus, just me as another student in a class of 25, because it's very easy to say, okay, he can't get it, let's move on because the other classmates can get it. So what's happening with, children today is that they're getting left behind if they can't keep up. So if they're struggling in one area, yes, they might be able to get tutoring if there was some availability, but oftentimes there is no room for that. So maybe their parents can't take them or pick them up after school. It could be that the school doesn't have any programs for that, or that the kid doesn't even know about the program. So it's just kind of like they come in and they just kind of do their school, they get their report card, and then that is that. That is why sometimes you can get a boy, 15, 16-year-old, who doesn't know how to read or maybe do even basic math. And you have to ask yourself, how far have we come where where we're leaving these boys behind? And of course, they're doing other things. They might be hanging out with friends, and maybe we can look at, inner city stuff where they're doing drugs and stuff and hanging out with gangs. So their mindset is very different. It's not so much on education, but of course they can be led to love education and to love learning, but it's very different for boys, because if we think of schooling, boys are very kinesthetic when it comes to learning.
Absolutely.
They need to move. They want to wiggle. They want to get up, and that does not help classroom management. I'm not sure if you know that, but it's definitely something that is shunned. Don't move, sit still, be quiet, don't raise your hand unless you have to go to the bathroom. I'm up here, the teacher is trying to give that lesson. So our schools today developed to educating boys correctly.
So, one thing is, just so you know, you go to any state in the country and you're going to find that boys are behind in reading at all grade levels. And not only that, across the races. So Asian males, Asian females, black males, black females, white males, white females, Hispanic. You go down the list and you're going to find that all boys of all races are behind their female counterparts. And in many instances across. That there's clearly a sex difference in the outcome. When you look at math outcomes, there's not really a gap. It's pretty equal, maybe slight, but very manageable. But the reading gap is double digits. And you're looking at a full grade level or more. And so I think when we look at that, we have to say, okay, what do we do? Well, I think it's what we read, and it goes back to what you said, moving them around. In elementary school, a wonderful educator I know, Kim, she's just tremendous. And she just mentions, think of each activity as about a minute per age. If you're 8, it should be about 8 minutes at the most in an activity before you move. Those sorts of things, which when you quantify it that way, like, oh, okay. So I know, having done many, many lesson plans, that is how I orchestrated my classroom. You really have to come, and I've coached as well. And I was one of those coaches that actually came with a lesson plan to practice. These are the stations we're going to be at. This is how quickly we're going to move. We're not all going to be standing in one line waiting to receive one ball, while there's 20 of us in line. That just doesn't work. Well, the classroom is the same thing, right? If you're not moving them around and also getting them information that they want to read. Boys want to read about adventures in the aggregate, right? You may find girls who do as well. But when we don't educate from a brain sex difference approach, we do also hurt girls as well. And I'll give you the perfect example will be if a girl is not doing well in math and the teacher says that just seems impossible, her standardized test scores don't reflect what she's doing in the classroom. More likely than not, it's that the girl was compliant. And because the girl was compliant, the teacher may be confusing the student behavior with skill acquisition. And those are two different things. And then the boy who's running around and can't sit still is kind of crushing a test. And you're saying, okay, well, why does that happen? Right? Because he's done. And he's moving on to the next activity. And I like the part that you brought up about the kinesthetic. It's really, really important. And I've even worked, I was one of the few fathers who was the classroom parent for my son's classroom. And I loved it. You know what I mean? Because I understood education. I understood what was going on inside those heads. And so when I was able to engage, the teacher was thrilled because I would come with I'd send her a lesson plan. Do you want to do this? She'd say yes. And so that was good. But recognizing those differences and getting them to move around from station to station, even getting them to move their desks. So if you have, say, 3 formations, when they're moving those desks, that's a lot of energy being expended. Hey, we're in position A today. We're in position B. Time to move to position C. And those kinds of things get them up and moving. And when they do it, you say, thank you for getting everything ready so quickly. I really appreciate that. And now they're empowered. You are part of the environment that we're all learning in. And so that movement, you're 100% right, is really important.
Is the work that you're doing new in the sense of it's being brought to educators today or parents today saying there is a difference in boys, there is a difference in girls and how they're learning it and how they educate? Yet there's so many cookie cutter approaches to give the curriculum where they say they need to learn this. And if they don't learn it, they're either below grade average or they're going to be left behind. So it's almost like, are we doing anything to fix this and to address the issues with this, difference in the brains?
So it's interesting you bring that up because, our culture right now is really questioning the whole idea of sex as a concept. When I say sex, I mean gender, right? And so I'm going to make that distinction because gender is a social construct, right? Whereas sex is a determinant in vitro, right? Not in vitro, in utero, right? And it's determined. We know that you're a boy or you're a girl. We know what's going to happen when the hormones wash over your brain at certain stages of the developmental process. And so what I see happening in the educational system is discussing things like brain sex differences is unpopular. You may go through an entire school of education, get your degree in teaching, go on to become a teacher, and never actually learn what's physically going on in the brain. To me, that seems unbelievable to me. Whereas some people instinctively know boys and girls are different, and I know, having been around them, this is what I know to do. And others who don't have that experience are really going in a little blind. And so you'll see certain classes, for example, these classes that are how to bring, multiculturalism to the curriculum, and which is, it's fine if you want to talk about that, it's great, right? But how do you actually teach that? Or how do you teach a child whose brain you don't really understand what is happening? that boy brain, and we've been there, Michael, is going to zone out. It's just you're 10 minutes into the lesson and you just, the eyes are heavy and they're gone. You've lost them. And so I think schools of education need to really work on bringing brain sex difference into the classroom. They can do it in all sorts of ways. If it's not happening in the university, principals can bring it into their schools. Parents and school board members can start reading these books. This stuff's been out for decades now. We know through brain scans what's actually going on inside that head. And we have to spend more time focusing on educating and empowering parents, teachers, school board members, and policymakers to understand what are we doing. And I know the Goering Institute has been very successful in implementing programs in every school you can imagine, from Title I to private schools.
I think back when I was in school, and I mean, school was my favorite place to daydream. It was like where I thought about everything else but the lesson plan that the teacher had out, right? Spelling, I wasn't interested. Grammar, I wasn't interested. And maybe that's why I didn't do too well, because I was just always just zoned out, checked out. I was in my own world. And we can look at how the brain develops. Not until 25 is the male brain fully developed. So we are just constantly kind of moving through teenage years. We get hit with hormones, and at some point, we try to figure out who we are. And one of the questions I love to ask, not so much myself, but like to other guests, like yourself, is there is a difference between a boy and a man. But how does a boy know he's a man? Yeah, we can look at the sex, so we could say you have this type of body part, so you are a male. But it gets into the conversation of how do we start to raise more men instead of just allowing boys to be boys at an older age in life.
Well, it's interesting. When I was growing up and you said boys will be boys, it meant, we were climbing trees, we were doing, risk taking things. We were getting on our bicycles and setting up the ramp and jumping over the trash can. And we were doing that was boys will be boys. Today, it's become, toxic related things, which I think is incredibly unhealthy. That no human being, no group of people are toxic, right? I mean, that's just, so when we start using those kinds of terms, that really worries me. And they just don't belong in our schools. Because think about what the boy is hearing, or that works its way into your unconscious and into your conscious mind, and you just feel like an inferior person. And I think that it's critical that when we think about how we want to empower them to become men, we need to give them responsibility. We need to reward them for responsibility. And that doesn't mean, let me give you a perfect example. When kids were acting up in my classroom, there are two different schools. One school I worked at was a military boarding school. And so when kids misbehave, on Fridays, I would show up at their it's called like their den father, who was a military person. And I'd say, cadet so-and-so, can you make sure they're down here? I'd email them at noon, and they knew why I was doing it. They would go running with me on Friday. We'd run together. And then when we got done, I'd be like, why we're here? Like, yeah. And so they were like, then they started joining me on their own. We developed, and guess what happened in the classroom? The classroom got better. Now I'll go to a public school I was at where students would act up. They would never let me run with students, I'm sure. But I would make them come to my classroom, and they were fine with it, and clean the desktops. I didn't call the parents. I wanted to work it out man to man, or, young man to young man, or young woman to young woman, and just say, look, you're going to clean the desktops. And they would say, okay. They clean it. I say, and they're like, I know. We'd all be good. And usually there was a cookie or a piece of candy or something. I'd say, we got each other. We got each other. And so what I was really saying to them is, you have a responsibility while you're in this classroom, not only to yourself. And I should tell this to students. If you don't want to learn, that's on you. But you have no right to disrupt everybody else's education. And by the way, I'm not going to let you throw yourself under the bus. And I worked with very difficult learners, and they were not allowed to miss their homework because that's what they wanted to do. And I would chase them down, and we would get their work. But at the end of the day, what my observation was, is what you were really saying to them is, I respect you enough that I'm going to be there all the time in your corner. And when that assignment's not in, I'm going to keep going after you. And people say, well, they need to become mature. Well, yeah. Do they have two parents at home? Does the kid have one parent at home and who's working all the time? You know what I mean? Every situation is not the same. And yeah, as a teacher, you're kind of navigating that. And so how do we raise them? We teach them how to be responsible. We teach them that you don't blow off your work. But we also understand that we need to give them the type of lesson plans that engage their mind. Like it's like you were saying with when kids start first learning, and this is great. Parents can do this at home, by the way. Get blocks, the colored blocks like blue and red and yellow, and make all the verbs like red and make all the nouns like blue and make it simple sentences when they're really little and they're just learning, because you're going to laugh. I used to teach a lot of grammar. And so things you could do is, the car, beeps, and the red is beeps. And what you're really doing is creating colors with words, and you're really setting up grammatical structure for them at a young age. Does that make sense? And so, hey, I want you to make a sentence with the blue blocks, the red blocks, and the yellow blocks. And their little brains are working, and they're like, oh, this is easy. The car, swept down the street, or maybe not that complicated, but the boy walked home, right? And then they have colors on them and say, well, what's the subject? What's the verb? And all of a sudden, they're associating color, word, and action together. Can you show me the boy walking? Can you show me the car driving? Can you become a car? And all of a sudden, grammar isn't so obnoxious anymore until you get older, and then it is. But nonetheless, that's how I think you teach them, is lots more play in the classroom at the young ages, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. We have a ton of blocks for my kid, and he's just out there in the garage. We don't keep the blocks in the house. We do have a set of the bigger blocks, like the huge style, like foam blocks that we keep in the house because those are easy to clean up. But the little blocks, oh man, they would be a death sentence for me. Like to walk, to navigate in the dark with the blocks in the house. There's already cars all around the house, so I'm already, like having to increase my life insurance, just in case I slip on one of those cars. You never know what can happen in this house right now, so it's very dangerous.
How old's your boy?
He's 2 right now.
Oh, that's dude. It just gets more fun.
Oh yeah. So I'm definitely excited for that. And you brought up a good point early on. We talked the point of masculinity, and you said it too. It's getting a bad rap today, right? Politics is being driven into masculinity, and it's a phrase they created, toxic like masculinity, right? So what's toxic about it? And many people couldn't even tell you what's toxic about being masculine. So if you ask someone, they're like, this is toxic. And it's like, well, which part is toxic? And like, they don't know how to even say. It's just that they were told that being a man is toxic in a sense. So if you're assertive, if you're dominant, maybe if you know what you want in life, this is toxic, right? So they're starting to, drive something into the mind is so subtle. It's this: I don't want to be toxic because I want to be accepted. So I would rather not be masculine and step up. So I would just kind of be everyone's hero, be that 9 to 5er. Don't give myself a mission. Men need missions. And I'm going to give myself just the status quo of what everyone else has. And all these women in their dirty, they're like, where are all the good men? Well, it's literally that they were just cultured to say, you know what? I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to do what I have to do. Men maybe, escaping fatherhood, saying, okay, I don't want to be with this woman, right? But there are certain men who say, hey, I laid in the bed, I'm going to take care of this kid. Versus someone is like, hey, no, I'm gone, right? So it's the mission, right? It's being responsible. And you said responsibility. I even wrote it down because it's so important. Responsibility, where we have to give more young men responsibility, because if we don't, well, we're going to have a culture of men who are just kind of flaky in a sense, right? They're going to do what they want left and right, and it's going to get to the point where what is the man doing with his life? And we can say his life didn't surmount to anything, but we would hope he finds a purpose. We can hope he finds a mission. And typically, when you have a family, it's a lot easier to find your purpose. But for people who are just kind of going out, especially when it comes to men today in marriage, many men don't want to get married because of the 50% laws and things like that. So there's a lot of things going on with boys and men. But, looking at your first part of the book, the rescue plan for boys, right? Just that idea. why do boys have to be rescued? Because this is the, like the catchy first part of your title is the rescue plan. It's like, who needs to be saved?
Well, it's interesting because I think it gets back to what you said, right? So I go back, masculinity or femininity, these are social constructs, right? Whereas male and female are determined. We know that. And so we're so prepared to accept it, for example, in things like sports, but we're so unprepared to accept it when you can't see, when it's inside here, right? And so I think that when we discuss that notion of masculinity, we have to be really conscious and tell boys and girls, because girls actually learn this a lot through sports and often through men and women coaches, how to be assertive, how to be aggressive. We're teaching our girls to be more assertive, be more aggressive, right? And we're teaching our boys, so no, don't be assertive, don't be aggressive. So we got to make a distinction between aggression and violence, right? Michael Rearden used a phrase, and we used a phrase, aggression nurturance. Aggression is something to be nurtured, right? As opposed to hampered, right? We want that, right? And so we need to know how to push that in the right way. And most boys, by the way, get a bad rap for being unempathetic. They're absolutely empathetic. And they express their empathy in very, very different ways. Girls tend to be more verbal. Their emotions connect to their prefrontal cortex, and so they will verbalize. Boys will ruminate for a little longer, not because they don't want to talk, but because that's the way they're processing. And it's funny, you say, we'll sit with boys and we'll say, use your words. And he's like, what are you talking about? There's nothing wrong. And we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. If you want to get that boy to talk, go do something. And I'll give you an example. I was dealing with a student in a school district nearby who was suspended for something, for using the wrong pronoun of a person, which I think was a complete overreaction. But when we first started to talk, he didn't really want to talk about academics. He's a great kid, by the way, just a wonderful young man. I got a tangerine, and we just started throwing a tangerine back and forth. Well, guess what happened after about the fifth throw? He started talking, right? It goes back to your kinesthetic point, right? So we know that we have to engage them, and they're watching, they're empathetic, and we're putting these terms on them. They're patriarchal, they're toxic, they're not any of those things. And I think people have to be prepared to say, I'm going to push back against that and not be afraid as a parent, or even, I would say, a young man, if you're 15 or 16, to say, I'm not really uncomfortable with that term because it certainly doesn't describe me. And I don't think putting an entire class of people into a category is appropriate. And really just end it there. Don't get into an argument. But I'm trying to work with young men to be much more assertive, and young women to say, I don't think it's fair, because you know what the result is? 75 to 80% of your overdose deaths are male. 75 to 80% of your suicide deaths are male, right? That's what's happening. By the way, I looked at the participation rates of 18 to 24-year-old dependent family members in college participation. And who's always on the back end? Black, white, and Hispanic males. They're behind everyone else. And sometimes it's black males on the lower end. Sometimes it's white males on the lower end. Sometimes it's Hispanic males, but they're all pretty close to one another, depending on your economic quartile. So if I was in the lowest income quartile, it's those three groups are on the bottom. Second income quartile, those three groups are on the bottom, and you keep going up. And guess what? That's not a coincidence anymore. And it goes back to, like, we need fathers. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems we face, and Warren Farrell's The Boy Crisis is tremendous on this. We need fathers in our communities. Like, we need young men who want to become fathers and understand the role of the father is not subservient to anything. And it gets back to your point of, how do we get this? We just have to get it out of our systems. When I say our systems, I mean our educational systems. All this sort of stuff doesn't bring harmony. It creates groups, right? And you look at the one place it doesn't really happen, sports. Everyone's working on a common goal. No one cares. Like, we want to win. This is how we're going to do it. Especially at the young ages, if you can coach and really include everybody, don't worry about the wins and losses so much at age 9 or 10. That'll really help. And so to get back to your point is, because I'm trying to pivot toward positive things as well, right? What can we actually implement that we can do, right? And so I know that we have to take those terms head on, because I see them as forms of prejudice. That's what I see them as. They're an entire group of people are determined to be something. It's a form of a prejudice. That's what it is. I don't think men are toxic.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about action? People don't take action with positivity typically. It's more negativity. So as an example, the anti-smoking organization, I forget the title of them, right? They don't say, don't smoke, everyone, because if you smoke, you're not going to be healthy, right? It's positive, right? They say nothing negative. Or I didn't say anything positive. The negative is if you smoke, you're going to die of cancer, right? This is so much more powerful. So they leverage the negative side to say, hey, take action. So in a sense, like our conversation, it might seem like it's not positive, but it's exactly hitting home where it needs to go. Because if we just kind of say, oh, yeah, you should be supportive to fathers and to young boys and the men and things like that. Great. Like how many people are going to take action? Not many, right? People need to, be jolted awake sometimes because they're just living just kind of haphazardly in life. And they just think, like this is what it is. But it's not, right? Like the second part, right? Moving beyond the positive, moving beyond the politics of masculinity to healthy male development, right? That is where we're trying to get to. We're trying to develop men to be more healthy, not only the body, right? But the mind. Because if the mind is heavy, right? If it's, traumatized for whatever reason, it's going to have a more difficult time when it's time to take action. Meaning, let's start that career, right? Let's, start that family, right? Let's not run away, right? We're not running away from the dark anymore, right? We have to be brave in a sense. And I always tell single moms this, and I don't think they like it very much. I say, no matter what you do, your son will always look for another man to emulate, good or bad. It doesn't matter. He will look for another man to emulate. You can give him good role models, or he will go find a role model. Does in the role model he finds, it might not be a good role model, right? It could be the gangbanger around the corner. It could be, someone who's been in and out of juvie or something like that. And, he gets a lot of girls. It's like, I want a lot of girls too. So he's doing what they're doing because he thinks like, oh, I want to be like this person. But if you give them mentors, if you give them coaches, if you give them books like yours to say, hey, there's people out there who understand what's going on in your mind. And the only thing you have to do is ask for help or to maybe start a conversation. And I can't tell you how many young men, send me emails 18, 19, 20, and they're afraid. They're literally afraid to take action. Anything they do, whether it be college, whether it be going to the military, starting a family, like they are so petrified about the outcome of what is for them because we can look at the justice system, like how more men are going to be jailed for any type of domestic violence more than a woman, especially even if the woman started it. So it's like, oh wait, did you put hands on her? Sorry, you got to go to jail. So I've seen that firsthand. And we have to do a better job saying, okay, well, he's not only the victim here, right? He has to arm himself with knowledge and wisdom so he can act accordingly. I'm not saying that he needs to go be violent in a sense, but he needs to know when to take action. And one of the things Jordan Peterson says, you don't have to like the guy, but he says the most dangerous thing a man can be is a man who's not able to control his emotions.
Yeah, yeah. We have him in the book like that. We have a quote like from him like that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and basically that's the next part. Men don't necessarily operate in their emotions. Like we don't go to therapists and talk about our emotions. We don't necessarily go into our households and say talk to our wife about our days and say, hey, this is my day. My coworker was mad at me today, and of course we're going to have open communication here and there, but it's different than just kind of being, hey, these are all my problems, boo hoo. So it's a very different way where a woman will talk to her friends, say, hey, this is what's going on. They work through it. Men just kind of push through, grunt through it. Of course, they can find confidants, best friends, brothers, and they can, confide in them. But it's different for men, where most men internalize things and they keep it to themselves and they said they'll figure it out. So the question is, how can men emotionally regulate? It's not emotional intelligence, it's emotional regulation.
Well, I do think that when men understand how their brain functions. I'll give you the perfect example. I had a town hall back in October, and there was a group that works with inmates and who have fathers, and when they come out, they want to reestablish with their children. And every one of them, when they talk about what was going on, and when they learn about what was going on in the mind, and why they reacted the way they did, with responses and dopamine levels and things like that, they were like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I would have known this sooner." So I think when you begin to understand what causes anger, which anger is fine, violence is not, right? And it's making those distinctions. At what point am I so angry I'm going to move to violence? And it might be I need to remove myself from the situation immediately. I need to go for a walk. I need to go for a run. I know when I've had a bad day, the best thing I can do is work out. I mean, I work, and it's amazing. If I'm feeling angry, and we've had those moments with our wives where we're just a little short, and I need to work out. You work out and you're like, do you want me to make dinner? You know what I mean? And I think so. Men need to turn to exercise. I mean, they have to turn. I don't care if it's a walk or hitting a weight. I love working out, love hitting the weights. You've got to engage in physical, because I think when you engage in physical activities and you have that, I think that definitely helps. I think if you're a young person and you are looking, say, for therapy or counseling, I think you should be asking the right questions. I know it's going to sound going back to the book, but we address that in the book. I mean, get with a therapist who recognizes brain sex differences. We have questions you can ask a therapist. These are the questions you should ask a therapist. And so you're looking for someone who knows, okay, male and female are different in their brains. Now, we talk about, brain differences. And so if you think of the male brain on a spectrum and you think of the female brain on a spectrum, right, there might be males who are actually very sensitive. They're not girls. And there are women who are very assertive. They're not boys, right? And so understanding that and working with a therapist who understands that difference is really important, in my opinion. And so I think, to get back to your point, like, how do they do it? Well, if you feel like you need therapy, find a therapist who's like, there's definite difference, and have them explain to you, even if you read chapters of the book and you go to a therapist, you'll feel a little armed. Whereas, well, there's really no differences, and, probably not the right therapist for you. And so also regulating your own emotions, I think, like I said, like exercise, being able to walk away, you have to feel, it's going to say, you're the coach guy. I'm going back to the sports metaphor. If you're a baseball player, you just feel it, right? You feel the swing, or you're a football player, you just know it's time to get rid of the ball. There's this feel. And so I do think men are acutely aware, and they were designed that way, or else they died 3,000 years ago, right? If they didn't have that keen sense. So when you start to recognize that, I think it's the most important thing we can teach is to move away from dangerous situations and to figure out how to displace it. But anger and what leads you to anger, recognizing that until I probably get older, right? I'm less likely to turn to verbal cues, or respond with verbal. I'm going to offer up verbal responses and have this conversation. I'm probably not there. Once the yelling starts, it becomes something else. And for young boys, I think they really need to learn that their job is to be a protector. I think young boys, when they see other boys being beat up, you say, we're not going to tolerate this. I think young boys need to learn that they are protectors. And I think they instinctively know it. But if you allow the kind of certain mentalities to develop, and if you're angry, and if you're bringing that anger to school, and then your school's telling you you're toxic, and then you're doing poorly in your classes. Yeah, we know this before you get to school, right? Before a child gets to school, we already know in the aggregate that if you come from a single parent home, things are going to be harder. And here's why. Now, if there's, grandparents or uncles or something in there who are helping, yeah, but we know it. So why we don't want to lower the rigor, because we want them to come out educated. But how can we have the same expectation? How can we place our expectation on them, knowing that people are expecting parents at home to help? And that's why I chase those kids who I knew what their family situation was. You're not going to miss your homework. And I don't want to call your mother, but I will. I don't want to call your father, because I've had single fathers. They're busy enough. They're working. So I'm going to call them, and I know what that means when you get home. So we can work together and work it out like men or women, right? But for the younger people, we really have to teach those men about that responsibility piece we discussed earlier, is you're also a protector. That's what men's purpose in life is, partly, is to be a protector. And think about that message. We need to be protecting one another. How have you protected someone today? And it could be something, say, I noticed my friend was hungry. He forgot his lunch. I gave him half my sandwich. Isn't that what a protector does? Right?
Yeah, it's very similar to the aspect of leadership, where in high school, especially, everyone has tables that they sit at typically. So they'll have the jock table, with the sports people, the basketball team, the soccer team. They have the nerds. So everyone has their own little cliques, right? Everyone's in their own little clique. And a wonderful thing, if you really want to be a leader in high school, is you don't associate with one group alone. You say, I'm going to hang out with the nerds today. I'm going to go hang out with the soccer team. You just talk to them, right? Like, they're not going to say, you can't sit here. You're not the soccer player. It's like, well, I'm going to sit here and we're going to talk. We're have a good conversation, right? Just that dominance and that, like, being assertive a little bit right there is going to set you apart just to be the leader. When you are a senior at that school, everyone's going to know you. Everyone's going to say, wow, like this person is cool in a sense. I don't know if they use cool anymore, but it's a person who is a leader. Is I can go here, I can go there, and I can fit in any mold. I don't feel so comfortable in a little box where I can't, expand myself. And you have to be flexible as a man, because if you just say I'm in one environment and that's it, if you were ever given a different situation or circumstance, there's a high probability that you're going to break, and there's going to be a large period of time when you don't take action. Where if a man is going through a traumatic time, they talk about this quite a bit when a man loses his father. They say it's like a trial for him, right? Because he's now understanding, okay, well, this was my father's life. What is my life? So basically he's running through everything. He's like family, masculinity, mission, purpose, right? What did my dad leave me versus what I want to leave my family or my kids, right? All these things start to happen when your father passes away, where you don't think about those things until it does, where you should be giving yourself this idea of what is my next move, right? We should have goals behind goals, where we might be going for the championship, right? We could think of some of the greatest basketball players where they're going for the ring, right? But they have visions for more success, unless they're retiring every year like Tom Brady, but they have more in store for themselves. It's not like, okay, I'm going to stay home after the game and just kind of veg out and I'm not going to have any more purpose. It's like they can't do that, right? So there is a concept or an idea of some men just love to stay still. And some men, like can't, stop what they're doing, right? They have that mission, they have that purpose, they have that drive in a sense to do more, to be more. Which do you think is more appropriate for a man to be living in his own rights? Of course, it could be a choice, right? We can say it's a choice. You want to live a life of nothing? Sure, go for it. You want to work a 9 to 5? Go for it. Or you could live a life that is more profound in a sense, right? You are trying to change the world. You're trying to create the impact. And it's not so much that you're trying to change the whole entire world, right? I don't want people to think, oh, I have to change the whole entire world. Literally, just coaching your sons or your school's soccer team is enough to change so many lives. Like, I can't tell you how my coaches growing up changed so many lives around them. And for them, it might have been a $50 paycheck a week, like not much, but it was it was the intrinsic thing they got. So, my question to you is, where is the purpose? Is it in playing it safe or daring greatly?
Well, it's interesting because Warren Farrell in The Boy Crisis I mentioned earlier talks about the purpose void. And so many of our young men have a purpose void, right? We're talking about things like shattering glass ceilings all the time and things like that. But where's theirs? I mean, you're coming from that. So I do think they need to be risk takers. And when you're right, when you change the world, it really is one soccer team at a time, or one flag football team at a time, or whatever it may be. And so just so you know, I oversaw a program that had the Oakland Diocese, as is known as Catholic Youth Organization. We had approximately 140 boys and girls teams participating in playoffs this last weekend. It's continuing into this weekend. Do you know how many volunteers? They have thousands of volunteers across different sports: basketball, cross country, track and field, volleyball. And these are thousands and thousands of volunteers who help work with 15,000 kids. I mean, that is, without the one coach, we don't have the 2,000 coaches, right? And so that's changing the world. And so I think you do have to dare and take risk and not be afraid. I mean, we do play it a little bit too close to the vest and a little bit too safe. And there's a difference between risk, right, and something dangerous. But boys aren't inherent risk takers. They are. That's why that connection thing isn't quite happening all the time. But they do the more dangerous things in the aggregate, right? They're compelled to do it. It's in their DNA. And so if we want to shut that down, we're going to have a really hard time trying to move them to move forward with purpose. And so just look, I don't care what your career path is, as long as you're in it and you're committed and you do it better than anybody else, or you're trying to do it really as well as anybody else, no matter what it is. And if you have a home to come home to and a family to love you, life becomes a little bit different, right? And so I think you get back to your point. Yeah, dare. When I say, boys, go do things like you said, form relationships with different peoples, because when you do that, you're building skills. But more importantly, don't be afraid to ask for help. And so many boys are so afraid to ask for help, and the girls they do more readily ask for help because they're kind of built that way. Our schools are really built more for girls today than they really are for boys. And you are seeing some changes in girls' scores as well. And the reason that's happening is, again, we're moving away from this kind of brain sex difference approach to teach them the really rudimentary skills of reading and writing and mathematics and science. And we're doing other things with them. So yeah, don't be afraid to acknowledge the risk-taking elements that are there.
Definitely agree with that. We do have to look for help too, not just ask, because when it comes to help, we'll look around before we look out, right? Because maybe the people around you might not be able to help you. Maybe they have their own circumstances. And sometimes when people are going through the gauntlet, they just are so hyper focused on their lives and themselves. And you need to find someone who is regulated and saying, hey, I'm good. Are you good? Versus I'm barely making it. Like, yeah, are you okay? Like not many people can do that. So if you are around those people, look out of your circle, look out. Again, I have people emailing me. I'm sure people email you, like inquiring, saying, hey, like a little question. It could be about a girl or but your family. It could be something so small, right, to us. And I love those emails because it takes me 5 minutes to respond to it, probably until they get an answer that they feel good with, right? But typically, fear is, one of the reasons why they're writing the email. And they're just looking for some encouragement to be brave. And they had to be brave already to, write me an email, because I could have ignored it. I could have said, man up, stop being a baby or something, or a girl, like I could have said something to belittle him, but I know not to do that. But again, do they know that everyone that they put trust in is going to use that trust appropriately? So they would rather not deviate out. And I encourage you to find the people who have a track record of being trustworthy, right? Just like yourself, Sean, you have written this book not only for the men, but for the boys and for the parents and for educators and, in their own right, to help them aware of what's going on in the mind and the brain of a boy and a man later on in life. And these are critical components for raising a young boy correctly, in the sense of, if we want to have him be a leader, to be prosperous in life, we have to look at where he is and where he's going, versus of the cookie cutter approach of the curriculum saying, well, this is what everyone else is doing, you should do it too. So, our conversation is definitely the cusp of where we need to be with men, boys, masculinity. And it's a deeper dive because we don't necessarily know the listener's situation, whether you're a single mom, single father, maybe you have two-parent household, but you're both working, so you don't have time to raise your kids. You're in the inner city and there's not much support. We don't know your situation, but who knows your situation? You do. right? You know where you are right now. You know if you need some assistance. And they say it takes a village, right? It takes a tribe to raise a child. And yes, you can do a phenomenal job as a parent yourself. And I already have coaches lined up for my son. Like literally, I have a school, martial arts schools right down the road, and the men there are phenomenal. I would entrust them for years with my son. It doesn't matter the cost, right? Because I know they're going to give him exactly what he needs. He needs bravery, he needs courage, he needs discipline, he needs responsibility. All the things that I know are going to compound into helping him become the person that I know he can. And it's not so much of me giving him that responsibility, it's him understanding that it is his journey for him to go on. And basically, that's what we have to go on. We have to go on the journey. We have to find out what is for us. And, this conversation is definitely part of that journey for you. It's definitely going to be an eye opening, maybe experience to say, hey, let me pay attention to what's going on in my mind, in my brain, in my life. So, as we begin to wrap up, Sean, I would love to get some final words from you. And then also, if you could, please tell the audience where they can find you.
Sure. You can find me on Substack at inhiswords.us. And you can always email me at Sean, SENK, at airr.pro. That's one of my emails. Or you can always email me at Sean K, SEN, at GIBM.us. That's the Global Initiative for Boys and Men. And you can get Boys a Rescue Plan on Amazon. So hopefully people will go and do that, because I think it really will be helpful to so many people, not just teachers and parents and policymakers and coaches as well. Just thinking about, well, I didn't really think about what's going on in their heads, even though they know it instinctively, even thinking about ways they can help. And so that's kind of how you can get a hold of me that way.
Perfect. And I'm going to make it easy for everyone. All of the links are going to be right down below, because when it comes to emails, you might get it wrong. It gets sent back to sender saying it doesn't exist. Well, guess what? These emails down below will exist. So send a message to Sean. Check out his book on Amazon. That was also going to be there. It's going to be a wonderful read. Again, we have to instill ourselves with many of the things that we are not aware of, because we might think that we are doing a good job and there's so many missing pieces and there's so many components. So that's why I say, like, you can learn how to build a house, right? But then, do you know how to do the plumbing? Do you know how to do the electricity? Do you know how to pour the concrete, the temperature and everything? Yeah, sure, you can go to Google. Yeah, sure, you can spend hours, if not days or weeks and months or years learning this and perfecting it. Or you can say, I'm going to get a guy who knows concrete. I'm going to get an electrician. I'm going to get a plumber. I'm going to get a builder. And then together you build the house, right? And that house is the figurative sense of life, right? The life that you're trying to build, you get the people that have already done the work, who have done the research. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel every single day, right? We are trying to make progress, right? So we have 4 wheels on our car. If you have a motorcycle, 2. If you have a motorcycle, tripod, whatever you call those things, you have 3. We are making forward progress, right? You're not going to say, well, I have to go to work, let me build a car, right? You go buy a car, you go lease a car, you go rent a car, right? So it's the same thing in this situation, right? We're making forward progress and momentum. We have it. But don't be one of those people saying, I'm going to do this all by myself. And again, I understand when it comes to men, we want to be that person who does everything. But then we also have to understand ego and humility, where we don't allow our ego to get in the way. And we can be humble to understand that we don't know everything yet, or ever will, maybe. So we get people that can help us, right? And people that we can trust. So trust is a big component. There is going to be the aspect of fear there, maybe initially, just how you were throwing the ball with that student. It took a couple times, but the 5th time he was ready to talk. So send a couple emails, right? Listen to a couple more episodes, and then take some action, right? It doesn't have to be big, but small action can change your life for the better. Sean, thank you so much for coming on, spending some time, and of course, talking about your work today.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And good luck with your own son and moving along. I'm happy you're finding male role models for him. I think that's great. Good work.